Welcome to the International Schools Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Taylor, and on the podcast we discuss all aspects of technology and life in international schools, with new episodes live every 2 weeks. We focus on people currently working in international schools, and we talk about life in their current country, and then we dive into some specific topics. The podcast is sponsored by Apps Events. We're a Google for Education partner and made up of former educators, all experts in helping schools integrate Google into their schools and classrooms. All training is customized for every school to make sure it has lasting impact. We're also experts on online virtual Google training, and we can deliver all our certification bootcamps and training completely online to schools. We have teams in Europe and the Middle East, Asia and the US, and we can help you wherever you are. Check it out over at appsevents.com. We're also delighted to say we're now an ISTE partner, and we're delivering the ISTE Certified Educator worldwide with our subsidiary AE Learning. ISTE certification is a pedagogy-focused, vendor-neutral, professional certification aimed at educators wishing to transform their EdTech practice. We run 2-day certification bootcamps, which are amazing fun, great networking, and will give you a huge boost both to your career and for your school. Get all the info at aelearninglab.com. Finally, the podcast is brought to you by Acer for Education. People ask us what Chromebooks and Windows laptops we recommend for schools, and after literally trying them all, we always recommend Acer. If you'd like to get more information, please just leave your email at gg.gg/Acer Education, and we'll get straight back to you. We go to Acer HQ in Taiwan every year to be part of product discussions, and they are genuinely the best thought out, cost-effective, and durable devices out there. And now, on to the interview. Hello, welcome to the podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be talking to Ken Shelton, someone I've known for a long time. Ken is an educator from Los Angeles. He's a Google expert, which is how we started working together and became friends. He's also an expert in diversity, and he can explain more about cross-cultural issues for schools and teachers. So, Ken, huge welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be on here with you, my friend. Good to be on here with
you. Ken, I was just looking at my email. Do you remember where and when we first met?
I don't. It's been so long. I mean, it's you and I have been.
It was 10 years ago. And it was Fall Q. In Mountain, what's it called? Mountain.
Oh, that's right, in Napa.
American Canyon. Yeah.
Wow.
And then I was doing a bit of work for Q at the time. I ran their first European event, which was a Google workshop for educators, and you were going to present. And then, because at the time you were in school, and you couldn't get away, I think. So someone else did it, but we met up at 4Q, and then ended up working together on quite a few things.
That's cool.
Yeah, 10 years. 10 years to the day, man. Time flies, getting older. But Ken, look, really, I'd love to talk a bit about diversity. Obviously, it's something that's in the news a lot now. It's not a new issue, but it's new maybe to a lot of people. But before that, I want to get into your background a bit. So you're from LA and you kind of still live in LA. How did it all start? I know you went to college, and I believe you were a football player for UCLA. Is that right?
Yes, go Bruins. Yes.
Yeah.
So I grew up here in Los Angeles, and ultimately, I've been here my whole life. I have had the opportunity and privilege to go to a lot of places around the world. I think when I last counted, I've been to more than 50 countries, which is definitely a privilege, especially considering how much I love to travel. And quite frankly, that those travels have really helped shape my worldview on things that help hypersensitize and hyper-localize my view on things, not just here in Los Angeles, but quite frankly, even shaped the work that I do. But yeah, so I grew up here in Los Angeles, went to UCLA, go Bruins. I was fortunate enough to play sports in college. I played football and ran track. And then, growing up here in Los Angeles, aside from my aspirations to play professional football, which sadly I didn't make it, but most of us don't. Yeah. I did acting and modeling for a number of years. I was in 2 different theater groups for about 4 years total time. And I come from a family of educators. So, for me, education has always been a very important part of my family. One of the things that, you mentioned the diversity thing, and I will share that I have done my absolute best for my entire life to dispel, dismantle, and debunk as many stereotypes that generally get applied to me as possible. And so one of the common stereotypes that is applied to especially a Black male here in the United States are that, for example, that all we're good at are sports or music. Now, sports was a vehicle for me to, get to college. I had an opportunity to go to several other universities as well, but UCLA was pretty much my first choice. But again, with education though, I come from a family of educators, and so again, one of the stereotypes is the enduring data around many folks that are of a marginalized cultural identity are the first in their family to go to college. I am not the first. I'm not the second or the third. I know for sure I'm at least the fourth and maybe even the fifth generation of my family to go to college, which says a lot if you consider that you go back, 3 generations and then of my family, and then you get into members of my family or my ancestors that were enslaved at one point. So, the fact that we have a long lineage of educational access is a significant accomplishment in and of itself. So ultimately, because of being, coming from a family of educators, I shifted into education. My father was a chief business officer for several county offices of education here in California. So to put that in perspective for your international audience, it would be the equivalent of you have your Ministry of Education, which handles like the whole country, and then you have your provincial Ministry of Education. So my dad was the chief business officer for the equivalent of a provincial Ministry of Education.
Right. I mean, California is like a country in itself, isn't it? California's anywhere else in the world, California would be a country. I mean, it's huge.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So then, I got into education. I got my certifications. I have a master's degree. And, ultimately in the context of, I would say I had an epiphany with my students probably around 1998, 99, right in there where, and I'll never forget this. So that year, that was one of the principals I worked with that I really, really enjoyed. He was such a good guy, and he and I hit it off right from the beginning because he played college football at the University of Michigan. And so ultimately the nexus of that year was I wanted to teach social studies, which is history. And I said, I don't want to use the textbook at all. I have enough computers in the classroom so that half the students can be on a computer at one time and the other half won't. And I wanted to basically, I didn't have the terminology then that I do now, but essentially decolonize the curriculum and provide the students with a learning experience and learning access, which is part of an equity lens and digital equity. I want to provide them with access to narratives, research, and information that was either intentionally omitted from the textbook or did not go deeply as far as the information in the textbook. And so that was my epiphany as to how important and how necessary the use of technology is in education.
Sure.
And then, of course, as you shared later on, I was fortunate enough to become what is now called a Google Certified Innovator, an Apple Distinguished Educator, and many, many other things I do in the tech world. But my primary lens is in the world of anti-bias, diversity, anti-racist, and decolonizing the curriculum.
Great. So you worked, and how long did you work as a teacher? Was it like 10 years or something? You worked for in a school?
Oh, actually longer. If you count even the times that I subbed, I worked in the classroom for over 20 years.
Okay, wow, that's a lot of time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, LA, talking about diversity, I think LA's, or probably California in general, it's one of the most diverse places that I've been. I think Los Angeles especially, because obviously there's different ethnic groups in America, but everyone from every country in the world wants to go to LA, so it's kind of, I mean, there's no novelty value in Los Angeles. As an English person in America, you might get a bit of novelty value somewhere. Like in LA, no one would even notice that, because people are from everywhere there, it's like every accent, every race and culture.
You do, and honestly, that was one of the beauties of the schools that I worked in. Is I remember one of the classes back, I want to say this was 2001 or 2002 that I had requested to be able to teach the honors classes as well as the ESL classes, which for your audience, ESL stands for English as a Second Language, which means you have students that English is not the primary language spoken in the home. And I love that class big time. There were probably, if I remember correctly, there were more than a dozen different languages and
Yeah.
cultural identities in one class, which was so amazing. It's so amazing.
Sure.
That to me is what every learning environment should look like. Is you really, it's an environment where every student's cultural identity is not only affirmed, but you create mechanisms for them to share elements of their cultural identity as a part of and to advance group learning. I mean, I learned a whole lot from my students. I got
Sure.
invited to homes. I want to say that year I went to, for sure, at least 3 or 4 quinceañera parties, for sure 3 or 4 bar bat mitzvahs. I got invited. I went, and I don't remember the official name, but I remember going and having dinner with one of my students and a family at the end of Ramadan.
Yeah.
And I know there's an official name for that, the end of the big fast. But even, I mean, I don't remember the name now, but my main point is, think about how fruitful that was for me, being one, as a teacher, invited into their homes or into the events that they're doing, and then think about the significance of those events as far as those families go, that they wanted to include me in that.
Yeah,
And that's a big deal, I mean, that beats anything that happens that is based on the curriculum or quite frankly the classroom.
Sure. And then following on from teaching, like you said, you've worked as a trainer, you've done equity stuff, you've done Google stuff, and you've basically kind of worked all around the world.
Yes. When I left the classroom, I've had the fortunate opportunity to do a lot of talks, a lot of trainings, and a lot of support for international schools in quite a few countries. I had the privilege of doing some of that work with you.
I was just thinking, yeah, we've worked together in Frankfurt, in Manila, in Philippines, in Bangkok, and at least with some other places as well. Yeah, definitely at least twice.
Don't forget, because you took me by your where you grew up. We were up in Halifax.
Yeah, you stayed in my parents' house. Yeah, and Halifax, right. Of course. Halifax, yeah, the North Halifax Summit in the coast, Yorkshire. Yeah, I forgot about that.
Yeah. That was fun. And you took me around. Didn't you take me to the area where the Bronte sisters?
Yeah, exactly. That's Haworth, where I'm from, is the Bronte village. Yes, okay, exactly. Right, it's where I know you got a few photos. It's one of the most famous tourist spots in the UK. Actually, and a lot of Japanese visitors. The signs in the village are in Japanese as well as English. So Brontes are super popular in Japan.
Wow,
and a lot of Americans as well. So.
Yeah, you and I got a lot of adventures together. I know we were supposed to work together in Africa, but I couldn't. I couldn't make it happen.
Senegal, we did. That was amazing. The Senegal event was really, that was an amazing experience.
Yeah.
But yeah, so you've worked all around the world now. Kind of brings us on to the work you're doing a lot of now around diversity, equity, inclusion, and stuff. Like, I mean, I guess what is the starting point is like, I guess it's a big question, but kind of what is the issue that you're helping to tackle? Like, does it boil down to a few different things, or how would you kind of describe what the issue is that you're helping schools with?
I mean, ultimately, there's 2 major areas with that. One is that work is aligned with a deeper understanding of humanity, and then 2, that work is aligned with some of what you and I have just shared, that your audience, the experiences you and I have shared, the experiences you've had individually, experiences I've had individually, and that is, making effective, meaningful, and fruitful cross-cultural connections. I mean, you think about the places you've been, the places I've been, the places you and I've been together, and, did we feel out of place? Were we able to adapt to that environment? Were we able to not only adapt to that environment, but contribute to those environments? And so those are the 2 major areas, because, if you think in terms of where we are as a global society, you have to be able to effectively make cross-cultural connections. Sure. No matter what. It's either in business because of having a broader customer base. It's within all industries, because the likelihood of you working with or having interaction with someone who doesn't share the same cultural identity as you is going to be significantly higher the more our economies become globalized. And then in turn, what I always share with schools is that you would want students, and you should, if you want to talk about courageous leadership, you should want students to be exposed to learning opportunities, narratives, and interactions with not only those that share the same cultural identity as them, but those that don't, especially if you're looking at, for example, a college and university going culture, because ultimately, what is the likelihood that a student is going to have interactions with or have a classmate who doesn't share the same cultural identity as them? And so for me, if you, as I shared earlier, if you rewind back to that particular class, the fact that every student knew that when you walk in the doors of this classroom, you are going to be affirmed as to who you are, your language, your religion, your cultural identity, then that means that you can be your whole self in that learning environment, which means that everyone else in that learning environment is going to benefit because you're being your whole self. You're contributing to, which all of us are learning from, which advances group learning. I mean, it's precisely why I feel so strongly about not even just diversity, equity, and inclusion, but anti-bias and anti-racist professional growth. We have to have that. We all have biases, but we have to be able to understand that some cases our biases can lead to restricting access or restricting of accessibility of each other, and of course in education of elements of the curriculum.
Now, in terms of when you work with school on anti-bias stuff, like how do you start from the point of view of somehow trying to identify what people's biases are, like even if they're subconscious? Like, is that kind of the starting point? Is let's look at what people are your biases, and then we can work out how to kind of get rid of those kind of things.
Right. Well, so you can't really get rid of them because it's a natural byproduct of the way our brains work. The neuroscience behind bias is that our brains generally gravitate towards familiarity and ease of understanding of things. And so what happens is when we act upon those, it's called, and I don't remember the exact technical term, but it's social cognitive preference, which is implicit bias. So those are the things like, for example, using our travel stories as an example. Those are the reasons why, tourists, let's say from the United States, will go to a country and demand that English is spoken, only use English interpreters, only go to areas where they know English is going to be spoken. That's their implicit bias working because English is what they're most familiar with, and they don't want the discomfort of going to areas where they may not understand the language. Full disclosure, I'm the exact opposite for me, because I know that there's growth that occurs in discomfort. Now, to answer your question, the first big step to do that I do with schools is there's three big areas with that. One is an examination of the organizational culture. So what is the culture of the school or the school system that is prevalent, that is most prevalent? And part of that is through I would say data acquisition, and that data is pretty much only qualitative data because the numbers can be manipulated. Then the next step in doing that is essentially what I call holding a mirror up to yourself, and you have to get a deeper understanding as to who you are as an individual, what your perspectives and views are on your environment, what environments you choose to be in, how do those potentially perpetuate your implicit biases, and then really do a self-examination on who you surround yourself with and what things like what media you consume and things like that. And ultimately what happens is if educators don't do that, then those shape not only the curriculum that you select, but how you teach that curriculum. And then here's the big one, how you view your students.
Got it. We talked a bit before about, I think, you've said that there is a problem with some international schools. Obviously, there's a spectrum. Some international schools are doing a lot with diversity and having more people of color. Some haven't. Do you think it's an issue that maybe in the recruitment process, many international schools are not looking or somehow trying to recruit enough kind of non-white teachers and staff?
I do. I think there's two things. There's the awareness of it. So, for example, amongst my, let's say, very large circle of friends, and I think I might have shared this with you in a previous conversation. I didn't even know about the international schools, when I was through getting my teacher certification.
We were saying, I didn't even know about international schools till my 30s because I would have gone and worked for one straight away. I'm like, this is amazing. You can travel around the world. And I didn't even know they existed,
Back then I would have jumped at the chance to begin teaching at a school outside of the US. I had already traveled to Europe and South America at that point. And I knew how much I love travel and just experiencing different cultures, different environments, and things like that. Think about how amazing that would have been for me to have an opportunity to go teach at a school. I mean, in places you and I've been, in Manila, in Bangkok. I mean, that would have been an amazing experience. So I think for international schools, yeah, it's twofold. It's having the awareness that the schools exist, and then
Yeah.
also intentionally recruiting. But I do want to say that there's an asterisk with the recruitment, and there's two components to that. One is recruitment and retention.
Yeah.
Okay, so and I understand that teachers are under definitive contracts, and sometimes heads of school changes and things like that. But you want to be able to recruit and say, okay, if we sign you to a 2-year contract, that you will be comfortable with and contribute to the school environment, including obviously doing your job for that full 2 years. And then ultimately, the other thing that I would share for your audience is that the recruitment should not be an individual, should be a group, because you don't want to, like, you wouldn't want to recruit one of me to work at your school to where now I'm the only one, because there's a whole set of anxiety and trauma that comes with being the only one. And unfortunately,
Sure.
I know that all too well, because that was my entire career in the Los Angeles Unified School District.
Yeah.
So you want to be able to recruit a team, if you will, of teachers of color to say, look, we are looking at hiring in the following subject matter areas. We're recruiting you, this person, this person, this person, and we'd love for all of you to come and work at our school and be a part of our school community and our school family for at least the next couple of years.
Yeah.
And
That's
it would
great.
really, well, I do want to add just real quick,
Sure.
it would really, not only would it diversify the faculty at the school, but here in the United States, the United States Department of Education has released data on research, and I can send you a link if you want to add it to the show notes, on the impact that having, in this case, the data I have is the impact of having a Black male teacher in the classroom has on all students, not just Black male students, all students. And a lot of things they have in there are, theory support blank. My whole thing is those are not only just theories, those are 100% true, because those are the experiences that I had in the classroom as a teacher.
Sure. Now, Ken, when you've gone to work with schools, how do you typically do it? I mean, obviously you work in a lot of different ways with schools. Do you quite often go in, like in a kind of fact finding, do like a workshop, meet some senior leaders, or is it usually kind of an ongoing process, or does it vary a lot depending on the project?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it varies, but I will say it depends on what the needs are. So, for example, what you and I are talking about right now, that has to be an ongoing process. That is not a one-day workshop. That is not a checkbox.
Yep.
It is something that requires a really detailed examination on what the vision of school leadership is, how it's aligned with being more diversified, how it's aligned with supporting the teachers and taking
Yep.
the teachers through a very detailed and methodical process that, many of the school districts that I work with here in the United States, and quite frankly, some of the schools that I'm in the process of potentially working with there in South Africa,
Yeah.
it's a year or two.
Yeah.
I know with international schools, that creates a challenge, that you have the turnover and the attrition rate of teachers on the campus. But
Sure.
ultimately, if you establish it in the mission of the school, you establish it as a part of the school culture, then theoretically the culture is what endures. The people that get hired become a part of the school culture. They don't dictate what the school culture is.
Got it. And is there any other areas you work with schools? I've also kind of led the discussion, but is there any other things the areas specifically related to this whole topic that you kind of work with schools about?
Well, of course, you and I, our common denominator is the use of technology. And so
Yeah.
the other area, yes, that I do work in is, and it's a term that I use, called tequity, which is the intersectionality of technology and equity.
Yeah, that's a really interesting topic. Can you explain what does that mean and
Yeah,
how
so
schools use that?
it is a consistently evolving definition, but ultimately tequity is merging the use of educational technologies to provide students with culturally responsive and culturally relevant learning experiences that support their development of essential skills. But I'm adding to that definition that use of technology can also help dismantle areas of bias and areas of racism. That ultimately racism is anything that that identifies or perpetuates a racial hierarchy. So we can even dismantle that through our use of technology with things like exposing students to narratives that aren't aligned with the dominant culture.
Sure.
And and my identity is the majority minority. So when you really scrutinize the curriculum and you look at the things like what books are being assigned that the students are reading, what historical narratives are the students being exposed to, think about how technology gives you access and opportunity to stories, narratives, and even people. And when I say people, I'm talking about people across all subject matter areas that may not necessarily be in the standardized curriculum. So that's where the Tequity piece comes in, is that I really strongly believe, and I know you believe in tech as well, that tech is one of the most effective and most needed mechanisms for broadening our understanding and our scope of learning experiences.
Definitely. That's fascinating. Now, before you mentioned curriculum then, and before we talked, you said this phrase like colonized curriculum, about some curriculums are kind of more focused. Can you explain what that kind of means and what the issue is with curriculum and how they may be more focused on one ethnic group?
Yeah. So essentially a colonized curriculum is a white male Eurocentric curriculum. And so if you think in terms of history, if you were to look at the totality of the historical curriculum, what lens is it told through? What narratives are predominantly included? Who's predominantly glorified? There's a whole idea around, to me, a true historical analysis. And I remember I had this actually in my TEDx talk, is you want to teach students to think like a historian, not teach them history. Well, if you think like a historian, when you look at significant events in history, you don't look at them through the lens of one particular narrative. You do an analysis from all sides of that same event. So if you think in terms of like exploration, so exploration on one side is glorified through the Eurocentric lens. We got on our boats, we explored, we brought back, we engaged in trade, we brought back spices, we brought back natural resources, we did all these types of things. That's generally the way the story is told. However, if you truly want to decolonize a curriculum, you don't limit it to that particular narrative. You say, okay, well, here's one perspective of this. What's the perspective of the indigenous peoples where these explorers went? What happened to them? Why do we not know their stories? How can we use, in this case, technology to learn their stories? And what if you were to rewrite that history lesson, if you will, what would the story look like as told from indigenous perspective?
Sure.
And that's one of many examples. It's ultimately a looking at the curriculum and saying, are we providing students with a broader understanding? Everything, and by the way, when I use that term, the colonized curriculum, I'm using history as one example, but I will tell you it applies in math. When I go into a math class, and I've seen this in several international schools, if I look on the walls and I see the posters of, significant mathematicians in history, I rarely see posters of women. I rarely see posters, mathematicians that are people of color, even something like the concept of zero, that was developed in India. But I rarely see that. And so, ultimately the whole idea around that is how beneficial is it to the educator and the students if they're not being provided a learning experience that tells all the stories?
Sure. Fantastic, Ken. Well, look, we said we'd chat for half an hour. We're getting pretty much up to half an hour. Firstly, I want to say, Ken, I could talk to you all day. Like, first of all, if any school is interested in working with Ken, any international school, I'll put a Google form up. You can fill it in and get in touch with Ken directly. I can say personally, Ken's one of the best keynote speakers I've ever seen. That's I've never worked with Ken on this kind of equity stuff. It's all been Google, but in terms of keynote and how he wraps everything together, definitely is someone you should have at your school. Where can people find you online? I'll put links to your Twitter and LinkedIn and stuff on the show notes.
Well, I appreciate that. And I want to say, one, people can find me at my website, which is kennethshelton.net as well. And yes, I am on social media. I use Twitter, I use LinkedIn, I use Instagram. I use all of them quite heavily. I love using social media to stay connected. And I really appreciate you having me on here. And, for your audience, I do want to I want to share one tidbit for your audience is that, for those of you listening, aligned with what Dan has asked me and what we've shared, as Dan shared early on, he and I have been friends for over 10 years. And you think in terms of where Dan is from, which I've had the privilege of spending time with him where he's from.
Middle of
And where
nowhere in Yorkshire, definitely. It's a
yeah,
very,
exactly.
very monocultural area.
But here's the thing, though. If you think in terms of what we just discussed in this episode, look at how much you and I have been able to benefit from learning from and spending time with each other. I mean, we've broken bread in many countries. And I mean, the last time you and I went to, remember, we went to Dishoom there in London, and we hung out for like almost 3 hours.
Yeah, I mean, went to Brick Lane, got a curry, and
right. Yep. So I think for your, for the audience, I think for you all, it's an understanding of Dan and I have been friends for over 10 years, and it's because he and I, education and more specifically educational technology brought us together, but it was our understanding of each other, our affirmation of each other that is the reason why our friendship has lasted and will continue to last well beyond what's been more than 10 years. And he and I both have benefited from spending time with each other. And then here's a big one. The schools that he and I have had the opportunity to work together in have benefited because they've had both of us supporting teachers to support students in having meaningful learning experiences.
Ken, well, thanks very much. Very, very kind words. It's been a pleasure having you on. Thank you very much for spending time today.
Thank you.